Welcome back, everyone. I have some new stories for you today. Here's the first one. I don't think I will ever be as good as her. I'm 28 and my boyfriend is 30. We've been together for about 4 years now, and we've lived together for the last 2. But I've actually known him for more than 10 years. When we first got together, neither of us planned for it to become so serious. But over time, things just grew naturally between us. We have a pretty good relationship. However, there's one thing that has always been in the back of my head. At first, it was just a small thought that popped up occasionally. But now that things are getting more serious between us, it's been coming up in my mind more and more. It's about his first love. Her name is Clara. Their story started when they were kids. They first got together when he was about 11 years old. They stayed together until he moved to Canada at 14. After that, they obviously couldn't keep a normal relationship going, but they still saw each other regularly whenever he went back to visit his home country. For years, he would travel there every summer for a couple of months and sometimes during the winter holidays too. During those trips, he would reconnect with his friends and family, and many times him and Clara would end up spending time together like they used to. Even now, they still see each other occasionally when he goes back. It's not as frequent anymore, maybe once every couple of years during the holidays, but they still keep in contact pretty regularly through messages. The thing that makes their bond different from a normal childhood relationship is the way it started. When my boyfriend was 11, he lived through a war in his home country. His father had been sent away to the front for almost a year, so most of the time it was just him and his mother at home. She worked long hours, and when air raid sirens went off at night, he and a small group of kids from his neighborhood would go to a nearby bar and stay there until the danger passed. People in the area kind of looked after them. The bartenders would bring them blankets, let them sit there during the raids, and sometimes even give them drinks or cigarettes just to calm down. Most of the time, these air raids happened late at night, so these kids spent countless nights together waiting for the sirens to stop. Naturally, they became extremely close. They went through terrifying moments together. He once told me about a bomb exploding nearby that shattered the windows of the building and cut one of his friend's arm with glass. The ground shook so hard they thought the building might collapse. Clara was part of that group. In the middle of all that chaos, they had their first kiss and started what you would call a childhood relationship. He doesn't talk about that time very often because it's clearly painful for him to remember. But one time I asked about it and he explained the whole period in detail. The way he described it, those friendships were basically the only positive thing he had during that year. And Clara was a big part of that. Before he and I started dating, he would look forward to trips back home the entire year. When he went there, he would spend time with his friends from that period of his life, and of course, Clara. At one point, he even returned to his home country to complete his mandatory military service for several months. Apparently, in his culture, it's a big deal when someone leaves for the army, and he told me Clara was the one who came to see him off. He once also spent a few months traveling with her across Europe. They decided to hitchhike through several countries together and apparently saw a huge portion of the continent that way. I've seen photos from those years. Some are from the war period when they were kids and some from trips they took after. They look genuinely happy in those pictures. Sometimes I catch myself thinking that the joy in those photos looks different from the happiness in pictures of him and me. Since we started dating, he has only gone back to visit his home country twice. One of those times I went with him, and that's when I met her. He acts differently around her compared to anyone else I've seen him interact with. It's not inappropriate or romantic, it's just different. He seems lighter, more spontaneous, more relaxed and open. It still feels like him, but almost like a version of him that's running at a higher level. One detail that really stood out to me was something very simple. He hugs her. That might sound like nothing, but he never hugs people. Not his parents, not his brother, not his friends. He always said he hates hugging. The only 2 people I know he has hugged are me and her. She herself is perfectly nice. She's been in a relationship with her own boyfriend for about 3 years. Now that she and my boyfriend are not seeing each other in person, they still message or talk every week or so. I have talked to him about this before. He told me that it's normal to remember your first love fondly. I understand that. The difference is that my first relationship ended because we realized we weren't compatible. His ended because life forced them apart. It's like their story never actually finished. It just paused when circumstances changed. And I can't ignore the fact that their connection was built during one of the most intense periods of his life. They experienced something together that most people never will. I wonder if that kind of bond is something I could ever match. He tells me that he chose to build a life with me. He says he's happy with the life we have and wants to keep building it together. He's always been honest with me about everything, and I truly believe he's a loyal person. But sometimes I feel like I'm standing next to a story that will always be bigger than anything I can offer. I would never ask him to cut contact with her. That would feel selfish and unfair considering what they went through together. Still, I can't shake the feeling that I'm somehow a second place in a story that started long before I arrived. And I honestly don't know whether that feeling is something that will fade over time or something I will always carry quietly in the background. Wow, that is a hell of a story. This one really made me feel some emotions. I can really relate to that feeling of not being able to match a bond and experiences that the two people have already had together. On one hand, it's like nothing is technically wrong, but at the same time, you just feel that slight bad feeling. I don't know. Maybe we just can't all have the fairy tale for ourselves. Maybe sometimes you just can't be the main character. Maybe. I don't know. This one left me feeling weird. Alright, let's move on to the next one. My dad tried to take something that belongs to me. About 4 years ago, when I was 14, my brother and I each got a bike from our parents for our birthdays. Our birthdays are only a few days apart, so they bought both bikes around the same time. The bikes themselves weren't anything special. They were about $70 each, so the parts weren't exactly high quality. But I decided to turn mine into a personal project. I wanted to learn how bikes worked and how to repair them myself, so I slowly started upgrading and fixing things. Over time, I replaced the chain, the wheels, the seat, the handlebars, etc. Whenever I got stuck on something, the local bike shop in town would help me figure it out. About 2 years ago, my brother gave me his bike too because he never really rode it. He basically told me I could have it as a backup if I wanted. So I did the exact same thing with that one. I spent time and money fixing it up and upgrading parts until it was almost as good as my main bike. I had probably put around $350 into my main bike and maybe another $250 into the second one. I was really proud of them. They were basically projects I built myself. Now, my dad has always had a strange habit of wanting the best version of everything, even when we absolutely couldn't afford it. For example, he couldn't just have a normal TV, he had to have a smart TV with Wi-Fi. He didn't just want a normal computer monitor either, he needed an expensive curved monitor. All of this while our family was often dangerously close to being evicted from our house. And before anyone calls me a hypocrite for spending money on bikes, I should mention something important. I have my own job, and I used only my own extra money for these upgrades. My dad, on the other hand, hasn't had a job for years. He also refuses to see doctors about his health problems. He has diabetes and blood pressure issues, but he insists doctors are just trying to convince him he is sicker than he is so they can take his money. It actually took 2 years of arguing just to get him to visit a doctor long enough to qualify for disability benefits so we could afford groceries and bills. Recently, he decided the solution to his health problems was simple: exercise. Exercise itself is not a bad idea. The problem is that he's way past the point where just exercise alone can fix things. He can't stand for more than 15 minutes without getting lightheaded, and sometimes he can't even walk in a straight line. Doctors have already told him that his condition is serious and that he needs medication to deal with the damage already done. He's also dealing with kidney failure and has to go to dialysis weekly, though somehow that doesn't count as a doctor visit in his mind. So he's definitely not in great shape physically. One day I was inspecting my bike after I had crashed it earlier and possibly warped a back tire when my dad came over to talk to me. He was literally leaning on the door frame just to stay upright. He asked how close I was to fixing the bike. I told him I wasn't sure yet and that the back wheel might need to be replaced. Then he said that once I finished fixing it, maybe I could let him have the bike to ride around during the summer so he could start exercising. I've actually lent my bikes to friends before. We live in a small town where you can get almost anywhere by bike, so it's pretty common for people to borrow one if they need it. But this situation felt very different. My dad was clearly in terrible physical shape, and I could easily imagine him crashing the bike and hurting himself as well. And knowing him, I'd probably be expected to fix it immediately afterward. So I suggested something else. I said maybe we could just buy him a new basic bike. He immediately rejected that idea, saying those bikes were garbage and would break quickly. I told him I wasn't comfortable with him riding one of my bikes because of his health, and because I knew he wouldn't be able to repair it if something happened. He said the bikes weren't really mine anyway because they bought them originally for me and my brother. Since my brother didn't want his, he said I didn't need both. I pointed out that I actually did need both because the one I was working on wasn't usable yet. I also reminded him that he had already said the bikes belonged to me and my brother, and I told him that if he really thought they were still his, I'd gladly give him the $70 we originally paid for them. At that point, he turned red and started yelling about how ungrateful I was and how unfair it was that he couldn't exercise. I refused to give in. Eventually, my mom came home and walked in right in the middle of the argument. My dad immediately went to her and complained like a child, saying I wouldn't let him use my bike. My mom suggested the exact same thing I had earlier. We could just buy him a cheap $70 bike to ride around the neighborhood. That made him completely lose it. He started shouting about how everyone else in the house has a decent bike except him. Technically, that part was true. My mom had bought herself a nicer bike years earlier when it was on sale. My mom came up with a compromise. She offered to let him use another, older bike of hers instead. The only problem? Guess who's responsible for fixing that bike up so he can ride it? That's right, me. At least the agreement is that once I fix it, I won't be responsible for anything else afterward. And honestly, I'm keeping the repairs minimal. After everything that happened, that feels like a fair amount of effort. Well, the dad is definitely not winning any Father of the Year awards, that's for sure. Can you really blame the guy not wanting to give up any of his bikes? I think his attitude is understandable. Alright, let's move on to the next one. How my mom came out of the closet. This happened when I was around 12 or 13 years old. One weekend, my mom decided it was finally time to repaint our living room. At that age, I thought painting sounded fun. I had absolutely no idea how much work it actually involved. My mom took a couple of days off from work because she figured we could finish the entire project in 2 days. To be fair, she was almost right. We moved all the furniture out of the room, laid down tarps, taped the baseboards, and removed the outlet covers. Everything was ready to go. We started painting around the door frames, and we were just getting into the walls when we heard a car pull into the driveway. My mom looked out the window and said, "Damn." It was her friend, Miss Miller. Now, Miss Miller was the kind of person who could talk endlessly. Once she started a conversation, it could go on forever. My mom clearly was not in the mood to spend half the day chatting while we were in the middle of painting. So she turned to me and said, "If she knocks, tell her I'm not home." I said, "Okay." A moment later, Miss Miller waddled up to the door and knocked. At that exact moment, my mom sprinted out the hallway and hid inside the closet in her bedroom. I cracked the front door open just a little and said hello. Miss Miller asked if my mom was home. I told her she wasn't. I explained that we were painting the living room and that my mom had gone out to get more supplies. Instead of leaving like a normal person, she smiled and said, "That's okay, I'll just come in and wait for her." Before I could even react, she pushed past me and walked straight into the living room. I figured maybe she would stay for a few minutes and then leave. I picked up my paintbrush and tried to keep working while Miss Miller immediately started talking and asking questions and telling stories non-stop. I tried dropping hints that my mom might be gone for a while, but she either didn't hear me or completely ignored it. She just kept talking. I accepted that this was going to be a very long afternoon. At some point, she had been talking for so long that my brain basically just shut down. I remember staring at her and imagining that instead of a person, she had turned into a giant pair of red lips walking around the room. The more she talked, the bigger the imaginary lips got. That's how desperate my brain was for an escape. After a while, we suddenly heard a noise coming from down the hallway. "What was that?" she asked. Thinking quickly, I said, "Oh, we have some squirrels in the attic." She accepted that explanation. She wasn't exactly the most observant person. Meanwhile, I knew my mom had been hiding in that closet for a long time already. It was starting to get close to lunchtime and I was getting hungry. I also knew my mom was probably starving and probably very uncomfortable. I again mentioned that my mom had a lot of errands to run and might be gone for a while. Ms. Miller smiled and said, "That's fine, I don't have anything planned today." So I kept painting while she kept talking. Eventually, she asked if we had any coffee. I told her we didn't have any made. Then she asked if I would be a dear and make some. At that point, I was mentally defeated. I went into the kitchen like a zombie and put the coffee on. Surely, she would drink one cup and then leave, right? Nope. One cup turned into two, then three, and she was still talking. By this point, I had painted almost 2 full walls by myself. I was honestly starting to wonder if a 13-year-old could have a nervous breakdown purely from being talked at for hours. Then finally, she reached into her purse and pulled out her keys. My heart practically stopped. Was she actually leaving? She stood up and said, "I guess I should get going. It's getting late." She walked over to the door and put her hand on the doorknob. I silently thanked every higher power in existence. Then she stopped. "I should probably use the bathroom before I leave," she said. So close. So incredibly close. She had been here for a while, so it was understandable. She went down the hallway and stayed in the bathroom for a few minutes. Eventually, I heard the toilet flush and the sink running. Finally, she came back out and said she had enjoyed our visit. I said something polite back. Then she opened the door, walked to her car, and drove away. The moment she left, I shut the door and locked it. Then I yelled down the hallway, "Mom, she's gone." The closet door exploded open like something out of an action movie. My mom shot out of there at full speed, raced past me, and rushed into the bathroom. Apparently, she had been holding it in for the whole time while she was hiding in that closet. When she finally came out, she looked completely exhausted and slightly traumatized. And I couldn't help it. I started laughing so hard I could barely breathe. My mom just gave me the classic side-eye look. She couldn't really be mad at me though. After all, she was the one who told me to tell her friend that she wasn't home. Even now, years later, I still tease her about the day she came out of the closet. That's a funny one. But some people do be pretty self-serving. And you don't want to be rude, so you just go along with their stuff. Alright, let's move on to the next one. My wife broke a promise we made. I'm 28 and my wife is 26. We've been married for 4 years and we have a 1-year-old child together. Before we got married, we spent a lot of time talking about our values and what we wanted our future to look like. One topic that came up several times was cosmetic procedures. Things like fillers, Botox, or facial surgery. Back then, we both agreed that we didn't want to go down that path. We talked about aging naturally and being comfortable with it. It felt like something we were completely aligned on. However, over the past few weeks, my wife decided she wants to get several cosmetic procedures done. Fillers, Botox, and some invasive facial work. Without really discussing it with me beforehand, she started putting down deposits using money from our joint bank account. So far, she's paid more than £2,000 in non-refundable deposits for procedures scheduled about a month from now. If everything goes through, the total cost would be around more than £10,000. For context, I'm currently the main income source in our household, so most of the money in that account comes from my work. We've talked about this multiple times since I found out. Every time we discuss it, her position eventually comes back to the same point. It's her body and she should be able to choose how she wants to look. And to be clear, I do understand the bodily autonomy argument. I'm not trying to control her body or dictate what she does with it. What really frustrates me is that we specifically talked about this before we got married and agreed we didn't want to go in that direction. I tried explaining that this wasn't just about the cosmetic work itself. It was about the agreement we had before marriage and the trust involved in sharing the financial access. From my perspective, we made a commitment about something important to both of us. Despite those conversations, she made significant financial decisions all on her own. Seeing the deposits appear in the account after we had talked about it made me feel like that trust had seriously been damaged. Eventually, I told her honestly how strongly I felt about it. I said that if she goes ahead with the procedures, I would seriously consider separating. I don't want to destroy our marriage, especially when we have a 1-year-old child who would obviously be affected by that. At the same time, I feel hurt and betrayed, and I'm struggling to see how to move past it. I honestly don't know how couples are supposed to handle it when something you both agreed on before getting married later changes for one person. While I also respect the bodily autonomy argument, sure, your body, you decide what to do with it, I do like the philosophy of, in marriage you kinda become one, because in my opinion, in a proper marriage, whatever happens to your partner affects you, and whatever happens to you affects your partner. So it makes sense that more or less all the decisions are made together. But truth be told, in this case, it isn't really about that for me. It sounds like the wife just broke an agreement that they already had, and on top of that, made some financial decisions all on her own, with the money that was joined. The one thing that's missing from the story for me though is the wife's side. I would really like to hear what is it that made her change her mind. Why does she want to do this stuff? I definitely don't like the way she went about it, but it would be nice to know the full story. Okay, let's go to the next one. My neighbors are becoming too much. My boyfriend and I recently moved into a condo together, and almost immediately we started having problems with the neighbors who live below us. I'm honestly trying to figure out if I handled the situation badly or if I'm just getting understandably frustrated at this point. The first thing that happened was the day after we moved in. Our downstairs neighbor left a letter on our door. In the note, they explained that they are light sleepers and asked if we could try to be mindful about the noise at night. That seemed totally reasonable to me. We had literally just moved in, so we were unpacking boxes and figuring out where everything went, but I understood the concern and tried to be respectful. A couple of days later, we got a second letter. Okay, that night we had been a bit loud. Around midnight, we decided to move the food from our old place into the new condo, and I realized the fridge needed to be cleaned before putting anything inside it. So there was definitely some activity going on late. The second letter was still polite but more detailed. They said the building had really poor soundproofing and that they could hear most loud noises from our place. Then they asked if we could avoid moving furniture between 11 p.m. and 11 a.m. That part surprised both me and my boyfriend. Staying quiet after 11 p.m. makes sense, but until 11 a.m. seemed strange. Still, we tried to respect it as much as we could. After that letter, I started paying close attention to what time I was unpacking or moving things around. Then, about a month later, we received a letter that made things start to feel ridiculous. That week, we had a new fridge delivered. The company didn't give us a specific time until the day of the delivery, and the workers showed up right at 8 a.m. They removed the old fridge, installed the new one, and the whole thing took maybe about 30 minutes. The next day, we found another letter waiting for us. This one wasn't as polite. The neighbor wrote that we had been constantly disrespecting them by moving furniture during the quiet hours and that it sounded like boulders rolling across the floor every night. They also wrote something along the lines of, "It's aggravating that all you have to do is wait to move the furniture, yet you seem to only do it at night while staying quiet during the day." There was also a vague line that felt a bit like a threat. Something about how if the noise continued, he might have to knock on our door and that we wouldn't want that to happen. At that point, I decided it would be better to talk face to face instead of continuing the letter exchange. So I went downstairs and knocked on their door. The conversation itself was calm. He wasn't aggressive and neither was I. His girlfriend wasn't there at the time, or at least she didn't come out to talk. I told him something like, "I'm sorry the soundproofing between floors isn't great, but we aren't making noise on purpose. We're just trying to live here. We also hear our upstairs neighbors sometimes." Then he suggested we exchange phone numbers so we could text each other if there was ever a noise issue. I gave him my number. Looking back, I probably should have clarified that I only wanted to be contacted if there was actual noise during the quiet hours they mentioned. After that conversation, we thought everything was settled. We had finished moving in, we put rugs down in every room, and we started wearing slippers around the condo to reduce noise. But recently, things escalated again. At one point, he texted saying he could hear us even though it wasn't during the quiet hours. I replied and asked him not to text us unless we were actually making noise during the times they considered quiet hours. Then tonight, he texted again around 10 p.m. His message said something like, "If that was you guys slamming the door, please don't do that. It sounded like a bomb." The problem is that we weren't even at home at the time. So I replied and said, "We weren't home and it wasn't during your curfew. Please stop blaming us for every sound in the building. And also, please don't text us outside your quiet hours." That's when he got angry. He told me I wasn't acting like an adult and said I had anger and control issues. He also repeated that he expected quiet from 11 p.m. to 11 a.m. so his girlfriend, who's apparently a nurse, can sleep. He ended the message by saying that I shouldn't message them again, which honestly confused me because I have never texted them first. I only responded when he contacted me about the noise. I don't think I was actually rude in how I responded. This may just be a case of neighbors expecting absolute silence in a building where that's not realistic. In my experience, a normal quiet time in an apartment building is something like 10-11 p.m. up until maybe 6 or 7, 8 at most. So them asking for quiet time from 11 p.m. till 11 a.m. seems just unrealistic. I would say the woman is understandably frustrated by the neighbor. Sounds like they really tried to not make noise and be quiet during the supposed quiet time that these neighbors asked for, and despite that, the neighbors were still being a bit too much. Alright, let's move on to the next story. I'm gonna call your boss. Today I was running a training session for staff about the safe use of medication. It's a pretty serious topic, so the session is structured and built step by step. It's not something you can rush through or skip parts of. One of the participants showed up late, about an hour and a half after the session started. I told him politely that he had arrived too late to join the training. I do try to catch people up when they are a little late, but this was way too much material to cover again, and the information he missed was important. He asked why I couldn't just catch him up during the breaks. I explained that the breaks are also my breaks, and I used that time to rest and prepare for the next part of the session. He said that wasn't his fault. I told him that being late in fact was his responsibility, and I wasn't going to give up my lunch break to reteach the first half of the course. Then he tried a different angle. He told me he knew my boss and that maybe I should just let him sit in and catch him up later. Then he asked if he needed to call my boss to sort it out. I told him go ahead and call. He actually did. He started complaining to my boss on the phone. After about a minute, my boss asked to speak to me, so he handed the phone over. I looked straight at him and answered the phone with, "Hey mom, what's up?" The look on the dude's face. I explained to my mom what had happened and why he wasn't allowed into the session. Then she asked to speak with him again. About 30 seconds later, he was packing up his things and apologizing before leaving. Got him, right? Alright, that's all I have for you today. Until next time, see ya.